so love this dress. This is Simplicity 9041 View C. Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Rochelle from Rochelle.Handmade.Designs, and in this video we are talking about this nice lovely dress, which is Simplicity 9041. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into the new video. Alright, so let's go ahead and talk about the supplies that you will need in order to construct this dress. So the very first thing that you will need is the pattern. It is Simplicity 9041. Go ahead and take a look at the back, and in the back, go ahead and look at your bust measurement, your waist measurement. Those are the two things you really need to look at for this pattern. So my bust is a 40. So I like to have at least 3 inches of ease. So 43 inches would work for me as the finished garment measurement for my bust. So I'm going to go all the way down here, and it tells me to cut a size 16. Now I'm going to go back to see where the waist is for a size 16. It tells me a 30. Now, because my waist is a 31 and a half, I tend to want to go towards the 18. So I will adjust a little bit to give me a little bit of room into the 32 for my stomach. Now, please keep in mind that this is elastic waist. So I may not need to do any adjustment to that, and I probably will not. Because it's an elastic waist, I probably would not need to do any adjustment, but I will go ahead and add an inch onto the side of mine where the waistline is. So that's the pattern. Make sure you have your pattern instructions as well handy if you need them, even though I'm walking you through the steps. You'll need your basic sewing supplies, which is the scissors. You should have 2, one for fabric, one for paper. Never mix the 2. Now, this is just my fabric scissors because I do not use scissors for paper. I have my rotary cutter for that. I use one for paper, one for fabric. I never mix the 2. I also have a white pencil. This is for me to mark, since I'm using dark fabric, for me to mark my dots. Also, a marking pen for if you need one of those for a lighter fabric. A seam ripper, just in case you make mistakes, you can rip the seams out. Also, coordinating thread. I'm using a red fabric, so I have my bobbing thread. I've actually rolled up another one just in case I may need it. And my regular thread. I have some pins, and then also a tape measure to take your bust and your waist measurement. One last thing you will need is 1/4 of an inch elastic for your waist. It's around the waist for that encasing around the waist. That's all you need as far as supplies. Let's go ahead and get started with the pattern pieces. All right, let's talk about the pattern pieces you will need in order to construct this dress. That's Simplicity 9041. So you'll need pattern piece number 1. You need to cut 2 of fabric. This is your bodice front. You'll also need pattern piece number 2. Now, please make sure you have pattern piece number 3, which is your bodice back. Make sure you have the pattern facing down on the fabric instead of facing up. You need to cut one of on the fold of this fabric. Next pattern piece you will need is pattern piece number 2, which is your front facing. You need to cut 2 of fabric, cut 2 of interfacing as well. Next pattern piece you will need is pattern piece number 4, which is your neckband. You need to cut 2 on the fold of fabric and 1 on the fold of interfacing. You'll also need pattern piece number 12, which is your armhole. You will need to cut 2 of fabric. Next pattern piece is pattern piece number 7, which is your skirt front. You'll need to cut 2 of fabric. Pattern piece number 8, which is your skirt back. You'll also need to cut 2 of fabric for this one as well. Next pattern piece is pattern piece number 9, which is your pockets. You need to cut 4 of fabric. And the last one that you need to cut is pattern piece number 10, which is your tie ends. You need to cut 2 of fabrics for this one. Now that I showed you all the pieces that you will need to cut in order to construct this dress, now I am doing view C, but you can do whatever view you would like on this dress. The sewing is pretty much the same until you get to the sleeve. So let's go ahead and start sewing. All right, so the first thing that I did was stay stitch my neck edge on both my bodice front and my bodice back. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and do the pleats. Now you want to do the pleats with right side facing up. So let me go ahead and turn this over. All right, so both of my bodice is facing up on the right side. This is the right side of my fabric. The wrong side of my fabric, I like to put a little X and the number. Then that way it'll tell me which one is the right and the wrong side, especially when you're using a fabric that you really can't tell right or wrong side. So for the pleat, I'm going to show you how to do the pleats. Now on this bodice, it tells me that my pleat is supposed to go to the left. Now your pleat is always supposed to go towards the side seam in most cases. So I made little notches. So here's my notch. So I'm going to take that notch and match it up with the notch that I made right here, right before your notch. And you're just going to pin that in place, take it to your sewing machine, and baste in place. I'm going to do the other one to show you once again on the pleat. So I'm going to go from right here, and then I'm going to move it over to where that other notch is, forming that pleat. And then I'm going to pin this one in place as well. Now I'm going to go to the sewing machine and baste both of these together. All right, so now that I have went ahead and basted the pleats in place on both of my bodice front, I'm going to move one out the way. So now you want to grab pattern piece number 2, which is your front facing. And the first thing you want to do is edge stitch the unnotched edge. So go ahead and serge this side seam. I haven't done it yet, but I'm going to take it over to my serger, and I'm going to serge the seam that does not have a notch. There is a notch right there. So you want to serge the seam the side that does not have that notch. And then after you do that, you're going to pin it right here on this side. And then after you pin it, you're going to sew using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Please make sure you back stitch at the beginning and at the end. I'm going to do that, and then I'll come back and show you what it looks like. All right, so now that I have my pleat done, I'm going to go ahead and take pattern piece number 2. And pattern piece number 2 is your front facing, and with right sides together, you're going to pin. But before you do that, I want you to go ahead and finish off the unnotched edge of your front facing before you pin it. So what I'm going to do is with right sides facing, match up the dots and match up the notches. So I'm going to pin at my notch first. And then after I pin at my notch, I'm going to pin at my dot. And then I'm going to pin at the bottom. And then you could go ahead and pin along the front facing area, the front part of. And then using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and back stitch at the end. Now that I went ahead and attached the front facing to the bodice front, the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and press the seam up towards the front facing. So you're going to press the seams this way, and then you're going to go ahead and top stitch. You're going to top stitch on the facing, not on the bodice front, on the facing as close to the edge as possible. Do that to both bodice front pieces. Okay, so I went ahead and pressed my facing to the inside, understitch. After I understitch, I went ahead and basted it along the neck edge as well as the bottom edge right here as well. So the next step is you're going to top stitch at 1.5 inches. So along this edge, line it up with your sewing machine 1.5 inches, and you're going to top stitch that front facing in place. Now, if one trick that you can do if you're not very good is go ahead and create a 1.5 inch line. And that way, it's lined up very good with 1.5 inches. Now, for me, my 1.5 inches is right here. So you could just create a couple of dashes like this, and then just follow that line all the way up and top stitch all the way up. So you probably can't really see my line, but I just need to follow my line all the way up and top stitch on that line. So I'm going to go to my sewing machine and show you what it looks like. All right, so I went ahead and top stitched both of my bodice fronts. This one was the example that I gave you on how you could draw your line in and just copy the line. And I did it on this one without the line, just to show you. All right, so now you want to grab your bodice back. That's pattern piece number 3. And with right sides together, you want to sew the shoulder seams together. So go ahead and match up the notches on both shoulders. Pin at the notch. And using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to sew your shoulder seams together, back stitch at the beginning and at the end, and do both shoulder seams the exact same way. Okay, so now that I went ahead and attached the shoulders, the bodice front to the bodice back at the shoulders, and I went ahead and finished off my seams and pressed them towards the back. Now what you want to do is go ahead and grab pattern piece number 4, which is your neckband, and with right sides together, I'm going to open this out, with right sides together starting at the back, you want to, this is your interface one. So you want to pin that starting at the center back, pin that in place. And you want to pin it around your neck edge. All right, using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, I'm going to start in my center back. So one direction to one direction, and then start back in the back and sew the opposite direction. Using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Okay, so I went ahead and attached the neck facing to the neckband. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and trim some of the seam allowance down. It's not much of a seam allowance, but you want to try to trim it down to about 1/4 of an inch. All right, so now what I'm going to do is go ahead and understitch on the facing. So since this is the facing, you want to understitch. Make sure the seams is pressed to the facing, and you're going to understitch as much as possible on the facing, not on the neckband, on the facing. Okay, so now I have understitch on the facing. So what I'm going to do is turn the facing to the inside. I went ahead and added a label. I actually added in my daughter's label because that was the first thing that I could grab. So it's not a big deal for me to add in her label instead of my own. So what you want to do is go ahead and turn your neck facing to the inside and give it a press. Once I press it, I'm going to make sure that that fold line is right over those stitching, and then I'm going to stitch in the ditch. So basically I'm just going to pin on the right side, and I'm going to make sure that I am sewing right in the ditch to catch the inside of that facing. I'll do that and show you what it looks like. Okay, so I finished my neckband and stitched in the ditch all the way around. So what I did was I put the right side underneath the left side when wearing it. This is the right side, this is the left side. So what you're going to do is cross the left side, that's this side, over the right side, matching at the center. And then you're going to base across. So go ahead and base across. After you base across, not all the way across, it's just basically to hold the kind of like wrap portion together. It's just to hold that piece together. You're going to base. Now, after you base, one thing I want to show you is you're going to flip it. I'm going to do this all at the sewing machine all at once. So I just want to show you exactly what I'm going to do. I'm going to base where I held those together with pins. I just held it together. So I'm just going to base from here to here. So with right sides together, I'm going to go ahead and sew my side seams. Now, I know I could have sewn my side seams when I was sewing my shoulder seams, but I decided not to. So I'm going to go ahead and sew it together now. Now, I am not pressing my seams open. I am actually serging my seams together. Sometimes I just like to do it like that, especially when I'm not adding any sleeves. Using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to backstitch at the beginning and at the end, and then finish off your seam. Okay, so I went ahead and basted the bottom together. I went ahead and sewn my side seams and serged it, finished it off. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and work on my armhole. So I'm going to put the bodice aside for a quick second. So get pattern piece number 12, which is your armhole facing. And with right sides together on the notch end, you're going to go ahead and pin. And I already did it, so using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, go ahead and press your seams open, like so. And then you're going to fold wrong sides together and press it all the way around. Now, I did it on this one to show you what it's going to look like when you press it all the way around. So what you want to do is grab your armhole and grab this. So I'm going to place the seams at the very bottom. Now make sure that this seam, if you did not press it separately, if you did not serge it separately and you serged it together like I did, make sure that seam is going towards the back of your garment. So with right sides together, I'm going to go ahead and pin right there. Make sure your dot is matching up. There's a dot. You probably can't see mine, but make sure it is matching up with that shoulder seam. So I'm going to pin all the way around. And you're going to do this to the armhole of both sides. Now make sure that you are using the right armhole because there is a notch and you want to make sure you are matching that notch up with your armhole and on your bodice. And stitching through all layers, I'm going to start at the very bottom in my underarm seam. I'm going to sew all the way around using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Backstitch at the beginning and at the end. Okay, I went ahead and sewn on my armhole facing using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I wanted to make that correction because I said 3/8, but it's 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and trim my seam allowance. So basically what's going to happen is you want to have this seam right here facing the facing, and then you're going to understitch as close as possible, but on the facing, not on the garment. So go ahead and do that. Okay, so now I went ahead and finished off my armhole facing. After understitching, I pressed it to the inside and then stitched along that seam and pressed it and gave it a good press. So now the entire bodice is completely done. So I'm going to go ahead and move this off to the side and start constructing the skirt. So I have pattern piece number 7 and 8. So I'm going to work on the skirt front first. So what I did was went ahead and stay stitched along the skirt upper edge. Stay stitch is done at a 1/2 inch. So go ahead and stay stitched both the skirt front as well as the skirt back, which is pattern piece number 8. After you stay stitched, what you need to do is on the center front, this is where you have 2 notches on the center front and the skirt front. This is pattern piece number 7, and I went ahead and labeled it pattern piece number 7, not to get confused, because pattern piece number 8 seems to be the exact same skirt, but the difference is pattern piece number 7 have 2 notches right here. So you want to sew using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and the end. Go ahead and sew your center front on your skirt front and then finish off your seams. While you're at the sewing machine, you can do this all at the same time on pattern piece number 8, which is your skirt back. What you want to do is this exact same thing. You basically want to pin on the center back side. That's where your 3 notches is. Back stitch at the beginning and at the end using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And then you want to go ahead and finish off your seams as well. Okay, so I finished off the center front. This is pattern piece number 7. So I finished off the center front after sewing the center front seams together. So what you want to do is go ahead and open that up. And with and grab your pockets. So with right sides together, you're going to pin your pockets to the side of your center front. So I'm going to grab 2 pockets. And I'm going to put the other 2 out of the way. Now, I marked an X to show my back pattern, my pocket pieces that are the wrong side. So this is the back. So I'm going to put this one over here. Right sides together, and then I'm going to turn this one over and place it on the other side. Now, match up your notches. And then you're going to go to your sewing machine and using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to back stitch at the beginning and at the end. After you have stitched your pocket on, you're going to press your seams towards your pocket, and then you're going to go ahead and understitch that pocket in place. So go ahead and do that, and I'll show you what it looks like. Okay, so I went ahead and sewn on the pockets to both the front and back skirt pieces. So what I'm going to do is with right sides together, I'm going to place the front over the back. Now this is the back pattern piece. I'm sorry, this is the front pattern piece. So I'm going to lay the right side of the back pattern piece, which is pattern piece number 8. I did label mine, so that's pattern piece number 8. And what I want to do is lay pattern piece number 7 on top. Now this is the right side facing up. And then making sure to match up your pockets, you're going to pin your side seams together. And then I want to pin where my dots are. So there's a dot right here and a dot right here. So that is your stopping point for your pocket. So you want to pin right there so you know exactly where you're going to stop sewing while you're sewing the side seams of your skirt. There's one right there. And now I'm going to pin around my pocket. Alright, so now that I have the side seam pinned, starting at the hem, I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and at the end. I'm going to sew using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to start here, and then I'm going to stop, break my thread after backstitching. Then I'm going to come up and start right here at this pin, still using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to backstitch at the beginning and then come all the way up to the end and backstitch at the end. After I do that, I'm going to sew around my pockets using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So basically I'm going to start at this dot, go all the way around the pocket and end right here and back stitch at the end. That's using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Do it on both sides. Once you're done, you're going to go ahead and serge, or pinking shears, whatever finishing you use, serge your seam allowance. Now I am going to sew them together, serge them together, but you could serge them separately. If you're going to serge them separately, you need to do that now before you pin them together. And also do that to the pockets as well. Now I'm going to finish mine together, so I'm going to serge that after I sew it together. So I'll show you what that looks like. Okay, so now I have stitched my side seams, finished off my side seams, and went ahead and sewn on the pockets, and also closed out my pockets and also serged my pockets. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and make sure that my pockets are facing the front. Now I'm looking at the back of my skirt, and this is the front of my skirt. So I'm going to turn my skirt around so the skirt front is facing up towards me. So what I want to do is make sure my pockets is facing the front of my skirt. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and pin, and I'm just going to base my pockets to the front and make sure that the seam allowance is still facing the pocket. So just make sure you base across your pockets so it could stay towards the front of your skirt. Okay, so I went ahead and based the pockets to the front of my skirt. So now what I'm going to do is go ahead and grab my bodice, my top portion, and then I'm going to slide my bodice inside my skirt. So now, because the front, I'm looking at the front, I want to make sure that the front is facing me. So make sure right sides are facing, and you want to pin at your notches in the front of your skirt. All right, so I'm going to start at the side seam right here, or you could start at the center back. It's completely up to you. So for me, I like to start at the center back. So what I'm going to do is start right here at the center back, and using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, I'm going to go all the way around sewing at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. After I do that, I'm going to sew again, leaving this center back open about a good inch to insert my elastic. But this time I'm going to sew using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Back stitching at the beginning and at the end, and then also leaving that opening after I sew the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. All right, so now that I have attached the bodice to the skirt using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance all the way around, and then I use 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, starting about an inch away from the center back seam, went all the way around, leaving a 1-inch opening to insert my elastic. Now this is called the casing, so I created that casing using 3/8 of an inch seam allowance instead of a half an inch, because I will be inserting a 1/4 of an inch elastic. So now I have my elastic. Now you're going to cut a piece of elastic that fits your waist plus a 1/2 an inch. So I'm going to go in where I left that opening, and I'm going to definitely go all the way around, making sure not to get my elastic twisted. And just make sure you sift all the way around. Okay, so I inserted my elastic. I finished. I attached it together. So what I'm going to do now is I tried it on, made sure everything fit. So I'm going to go ahead and serge the casing area to give it a nice clean finish. Once I do that, I'm going to press my seams up towards the bodice. Okay, so I went ahead and finished off the seams for when I attach my skirt front, my bodice to my skirt. I went ahead and insert the elastic and finish off my seams for the dress. So now that this is done, you could go ahead and put your dress aside. But make sure when you put your dress, make sure that you do not hem this dress until tomorrow. It needs to hang for at least 24 hours before you hem it. So go ahead, put this aside, put it on your dress form or hang it up on a hanger out of the way and let it hang for 24 hours. Now, once you have the dress done, go ahead and grab your tie ends. All right, this is pattern piece number 10, the last thing you have to do. So I'm going to explain what you need to do, and then I'm just going to go ahead and let you do it if you decide that you want a tie belt or tie ends like I do. So the first thing you're going to do is pin with right sides together. Go ahead and pin. And then using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, you're going to back stitch at the beginning and at the end, press the seam open. Once you press the seams open, it's going to look like one long piece, right? And then with right sides together, you're going to fold it in half. Okay, so the last thing to do is your tie ends. So what you want to do is with right sides together, fold your tie ends in half. So I folded mine in half with right side together, went ahead and pinned. So what I'm going to do is sew using 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. I'm going to back stitch at the beginning, sew all the way around, leaving a good inch. So I'm probably going to leave about an inch between here and here for turning to turn it right side out on both of my ties. And then once you do that, before you turn it right side out, make sure you trim your seam allowance down, turn it right side out, and give it a good press. Okay, I have my tie belts done. So I'm going to show you on one side. So looking at one of my side seams, so this is my side seam right here. And what you want to do is attach the end. Now make sure it's right sides together. So this is the right side of my tie belt, right? So I want to attach it right here to the side seam. So do that, let your dress hang. Once your dress have hang overnight for 24 hours, then you're gonna hem it. You're gonna do a narrow hem, so you go press up 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, open it back out, fold into that line and press, and then make your narrow hem, stitch on the right side, and then you are all done. Now you are all done with your dress. Go ahead and take some photos. Let me see those photos. Now like, comment, and subscribe. And until next time, keep sewing.